Most sailors never sink in a storm. They sink because of something they never thought to check. That's the reality. The catastrophic failures, the ones that end voyages, the ones that total boats, the ones that occasionally cost lives, they rarely announce themselves. They don't happen in the moment you expect. They build quietly, in places you can't see, in materials that look perfectly fine from the outside, over years of neglect or simple ignorance. I've been around long enough to have seen this pattern repeat itself more times than I'd like. A well-maintained looking boat, a confident owner, and somewhere behind a bulkhead, or inside a deck fitting, or at the base of a rudder blade, a failure already in progress that nobody caught because nobody looked. So today I want to walk through 5 specific failure points, not theoretical ones, real, documented, recurring problems that are sitting undetected on thousands of sailboats right now, including, possibly, yours. If you're planning offshore passages, if you're leaving your boat on a mooring this season, or if you're in the market for a used cruiser, what I'm about to cover is more important than your weather routing software. Let's start where the consequences are most immediate. Chain plates. If you ask experienced offshore sailors what keeps them up at night, it isn't wave height, it's this. Chain plates are the metal straps, typically stainless steel, that anchor your standing rigging to the hull. They are, in the most literal sense, what holds your mast up. When one fails, the mast doesn't lean, it comes down. In open water, in any kind of sea state, a dismasting is a serious emergency and potentially a fatal one. The failure mechanism is called crevice corrosion, and it's deceptive by design. Stainless steel earns its name through a thin layer of chromium oxide that forms on the surface. That layer resists rust effectively, but only as long as it has access to oxygen to maintain itself. Take away the oxygen and the protection disappears. The steel becomes active and vulnerable. Here's where the boat creates its own trap. Chain plates pass through the deck via a narrow slot, sealed with a flexible compound to keep water out of the cabin. That sealant does its job for a few years. Then the boat flexes, the rigging loads cycle, and the seal begins to fail. Small amounts of salt water start working into that gap, the tight, dark space between the metal and the deck core. There is no oxygen in there, none. What happens next is invisible from any angle you can observe without pulling the fitting. The protective oxide layer breaks down. The salt water begins creating microscopic tunnels through the steel. The inside of the chain plate turns into something closer to a corroded sponge than a structural component. But the exterior, the part you can see above deck and the part visible below, looks completely normal, often shiny, often perfect. I have personally seen chain plates that passed a visual inspection from both sides, that looked like new hardware, snapped cleanly with a single blow from a rubber mallet when pulled for inspection. There was nothing left structurally. The corrosion had hollowed them out from the inside. In the current used boat market, there are a significant number of cruisers from the early to mid-2000s, boats built during and after the previous production boom, that are now 20 years old. If those chain plates have never been pulled, they have never been inspected. Visual checks are not enough. The only way to actually verify a chain plate is to remove it. Look for pitting, black spotting, rust bleeding at the deck joint, or any dull etching on the section that was hidden inside the deck. Any of those signs means the fitting is compromised. Replacement is labor-intensive, but it is not expensive relative to the cost of a mast, a rig, or the consequences of losing either offshore. Through-hull fittings. If chain plates keep the mast standing, through-hulls keep the ocean outside the boat. These are the valves and penetrations below the waterline that handle engine cooling intake, cockpit drains, bilge discharge, and similar functions. They are, in the most direct sense, holes in your hull with fittings attached. When they work, they're invisible. When they fail, you have very little time. The failure mode to understand here is dezincification. It affects bronze, or what gets sold as bronze, and it is more common now than it has ever been. Proper marine bronze is copper and tin. It resists salt water exceptionally well. The problem is that over the last couple of decades, manufacturers looking to reduce costs began substituting manganese bronze, brass, or other alloys with significant zinc content. These look identical to marine bronze when they're new. You cannot tell the difference visually on a newly installed fitting. But in salt water, the difference becomes critical. Salt water leaches zinc out of the alloy through an electrochemical process. What remains is a porous copper structure with no structural integrity. The fitting holds its shape, it holds its color more or less, but it has become essentially brittle. Internal pressure or mechanical stress can cause it to fail suddenly and completely. Here is how to identify it. Scratch the surface of the fitting. Healthy bronze looks like a new copper penny, bright, warm, golden. A dezincified fitting has a dull, pinkish or reddish cast. That color change tells you the zinc is gone, and the structural value of the fitting is close to zero. You can also perform a hammer test during haul-out. A healthy bronze fitting rings with a clear metallic note when tapped lightly. A compromised one gives you a dull, flat thud. I have seen owners go to exercise a seacock, something you should be doing regularly, and have the entire fitting shear off in their hand. If that happens at the dock, you need a wooden plug immediately or the boat sinks. If it happens at anchor, overnight, the outcome is worse. Do not assume marine-grade labeling means marine bronze. If you haven't verified the alloy on your through hulls in the last few years, the hammer test and the scratch test cost you nothing and could save the boat. Wet exhaust hose. Most owners service their engines reasonably well. Oil changes, impeller, belts, filters. But the wet exhaust hose, that heavy reinforced hose running from the exhaust manifold through the hull, gets ignored almost universally. It lives in the back of the engine compartment where it's hard to see and harder to reach. Out of sight, out of mind. The failure process is called thermal hardening. When the hose is new, it flexes. It absorbs vibration. As a diesel engine runs, it moves on its mounts and the hose moves with it. Over 10 or 15 years of heat cycles, the rubber hardens. It stops flexing. It becomes rigid. The engine still moves, the hose no longer can. The vibration concentrates at the stress points, at clamps, at bends, and eventually creates cracks. Sometimes visible, sometimes not yet through the wall. When the hose splits while the engine is running, what happens next is not immediately obvious. The engine continues to pump cooling water, but instead of directing it out the exhaust, it's now pumping it directly into the bilge. You're in the cockpit. The engine is loud. You won't hear the water. You won't know there's a problem until the floorboards start lifting or the engine dies from flooding. By that point, a standard bilge pump is likely overwhelmed. On boats from the early 2000s, that original factory hose is over 20 years old. The test is simple. Go into the engine compartment and squeeze it. If it feels like hard plastic with no give at all, it has already failed in functional terms, whether it's cracked yet or not. Also check for soot marks near the clamps. That indicates exhaust gas is already escaping through microfractures. Replacing the hose is a difficult, unpleasant job, but it is a one-day project. A failed hose in open water is not. The keel to hull joint. On the majority of modern production sailboats, the keel is bolted to the hull rather than encapsulated within it. That approach is efficient for manufacturers. It also creates a structural joint that requires attention over time. The early warning sign in the sailing world is known as the smile. a fine crescent-shaped crack at the forward edge of the keel joint where lead or iron meets fiberglass. Beginners see cosmetic damage. Anyone with experience in offshore surveying sees a structural red flag. What's happening beneath that crack? The internal grid that distributes keel load is beginning to separate from the hull, or the keel bolts have started to stretch. Once that joint opens, even fractionally, salt water enters. Iron keels begin rusting from the inside, expanding and forcing the gap wider. Stainless keel bolts enter the same oxygen-starved environment we discussed with chain plates and develop the same crevice corrosion. The bolts corrode from the inside. Their cross-section diminishes. Under load, they can fail. Keel loss is not a recoverable situation. A sailboat without its keel inverts in seconds. The way to evaluate this during haul-out: observe the crack when the boat is sitting on its keel, then have it placed in slings so the keel weight is suspended. If the crack closes when the keel is unloaded and reopens when it bears weight, you have active structural movement. That is not a bottom paint problem. That is a surveyor and a shipyard problem immediately. The rudder. Modern rudders typically consist of a stainless steel or aluminum internal frame, foam-filled, encased in fiberglass. From the outside they look solid and symmetrical. The problem develops inside, where no inspection from the water or the dock will reveal it. A small crack, often where the rudder post enters the blade, admits water into the foam core. Foam holds water indefinitely. That trapped water, in a dark, sealed, oxygen-free environment, attacks the internal metal frame. The corrosion is slow, invisible, and cumulative. You won't feel it through the helm. You won't see it from the dinghy. The boat steers normally right up until the moment the corroded internal welds give way under pressure. When that happens, typically in heavy weather, when the rudder is under real load trying to prevent a broach, the post spins freely and the blade doesn't follow. You've lost steering control at the worst possible moment. In mid-ocean, that leads to vessel abandonment. During haul-out, look for rust bleeding from the seams. Brown streaks are a clear indicator. Tap the blade with a plastic mallet. A sound rudder resonates cleanly. A waterlogged, corroded one sounds dead. And watch for weeping. If the rudder is still draining water 3 days after haul-out, the core is saturated. The internal frame is almost certainly compromised. The rudder is not optional equipment. Without it, you have no control. There is no offshore scenario where a marginal rudder is acceptable. What connects all 5 of these failures is simple. They are invisible from the cockpit. They develop in places that require deliberate access to inspect. They look fine externally while they deteriorate internally. And by the time the symptoms become obvious, the failure is often already advanced enough to be dangerous. None of them are exotic or rare. They show up across all makes and ages of boats, and they are all inspectable, if you actually look. If you haven't pulled your chain plates, tested your through hulls, squeezed your exhaust hose, examined your keel joint, or tapped your rudder blade in the last 5 years, that's where I'd start this season. Not with new electronics, not with a new sail, with the things that keep the boat together and the water outside. If you've dealt with any of these failures, or caught one before it became a catastrophe, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. That kind of experience is useful to everyone watching. And if this is the kind of practical, no-nonsense discussion that's useful to you, subscribe. That's what this channel is built for.